everyone. Welcome to week 43 of the Bible by the Week. We are continuing to read through the four Gospels, and we have this week read a number of more teachings of Jesus and of miracles of Jesus, and something important happens in our readings for this week, which is that Jesus' disciples, his closest followers, are starting to recognize who he is. At the same time, the religious leaders are becoming more and more threatened, and so they are turning against Jesus. And we saw that in our readings for this week. Starting in Matthew 16, we have Jesus refusing to give the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, understand the Pharisees and the Sadducees were opposing political parties. They generally did not work together. They had some very different views, but they both came to Jesus to test him, to say, give us a sign, show us how you have authority, do some miracle. And Jesus tells them he's not going to do any miracle or give them any sign other than the sign of Jonah, which you might remember. Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and then spit out on shore. And Jesus is saying that he's going to be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and then will rise again. And this kind of baffles the religious leaders. And as they leave, Jesus warns his disciples against the yeast of the Pharisees. And the disciples don't get it. They say, well, why is he talking about yeast? Is it because we forgot to bring bread? And Jesus says, no. Listen, he's talking about the fact that yeast works its way through the dough and affects the whole lump. And the same way the false teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees work themselves into every aspect of life and completely corrupt the truth. So after this, Jesus and his disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, where there are a large number of shrines to all sorts of false idols. And it is the context in which Jesus brings up the question, who do people say I am? And they give him various options. And he says, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is a turning point, because up to this point, the disciples have believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they've seen his miracles, they've heard his teachings for quite a while now, and Peter has come to the conclusion that Jesus is both the Christ, the Messiah, and the Son of the living God. Now, there were various theories as to who the Messiah was, that he was going to be a political revolutionary, or he was going to be a religious teacher that would bring back enforcement of God's law. But this is the first time that someone's voiced that he is both. And immediately after this, Jesus starts to explain, now that they understand who he is, what he came to do, that he's going to suffer and he's going to be killed. And Peter takes him aside and says, Lord, this is not going to happen to you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Because this is the same type of thing that Satan tried to tempt Jesus to do something other than his Father's will, to not sacrifice his life, to not suffer for mankind. And so Peter has it wrong, again, not as far as who Jesus is, but as far as what God's will is. He explains that his followers have to take up their cross and follow him, that they will have to suffer on behalf of the truth, and yet that God will reward them when Christ returns at the end of time. Now, in chapter 17, 6 days later, Jesus reveals his glory to Peter and James and John. He rather confirms that he is the Son of God. About a week later, he takes them up to a mountaintop. His appearance is transfigured. That means it doesn't change the substance of who he is, but whereas he's been hiding his glory, they get a glimpse of his true glory. He's transfigured and glows white. And Moses and Elijah appear as the two witnesses. The Hebrew law said that everything has to be confirmed by the testimony of two witnesses. Well, you can't think of two greater witnesses than Moses, the lawgiver and deliverer of Israel, and Elijah, the first and quintessential prophet who did all these powerful miracles, who was predicted to precede the coming of the Messiah. So Jesus brings his three closest disciples down the mountain, and there are the other disciples, and they're arguing with the religious leaders because a man had brought his son to be healed of a demonic possession, and those disciples were unable to do it. And so Jesus does it, and they ask why they couldn't do it. Well, we're not clear, but it seems like they were relying on their own power or authority. And Jesus says, no, this type can only come out through prayer. It has to be the Father's will, the Father's doing. And so he chides them for their lack of faith and describes his coming suffering again. And then there's this interesting story where Jesus, even though he disagrees with the religious authorities, he submits to them. They're asked about him paying the temple tax. And, Jesus asked Peter, well, do the sons of the rulers pay the tax? Implying that he's the son of God, the one who's worshipped at the temple. And the answer is no. But just so that everyone will see that he is fulfilling all righteousness, he sends Peter out to go fishing, which Peter loves to do. He catches a fish that has a coin in its mouth, which is just enough to pay the temple tax for both Jesus and Peter. It's a sign of his submission to the authorities, even though the authorities are wrong. Now, in Mark's gospel, we start in chapter 8 with the feeding of the 4,000, the second time that Jesus miraculously feeds a crowd. Then it goes on to his refusing to give the Pharisees a sign and warning of their yeast, warning also of Herod, which may be a reference really to the Sadducees, because they were collaborators with the Romans, and the Romans had installed Herod as their kind of puppet king. Jesus heals a blind man, and that's the context in which Mark tells the story of Peter having the insight that Jesus is the Christ. Then Jesus begins to warn of his sufferings and rebukes Peter, and he calls his disciples to live a life of sacrifice. In chapter 9, we're told that 6 days later, Jesus is transfigured for his 3 close disciples, and he heals the demon-possessed boy through prayer in response to the Father's plea. And Jesus again tries to explain his coming suffering, but the disciples are preoccupied, Mark tells us, with who's greatest, who's going to be greatest among us. Am I going to be greater than him? And Jesus says, whoever's going to be great in my kingdom must be like a child, must be the servant of all. In Jesus' day, if you didn't have a paid servant in your household, the youngest child was always the one who had the most menial jobs. He affirms anyone who does good work in his name, and then he warns that it would be better to die, to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the sea, than to mislead any of the little ones. And in the same way, it would be better to have your hand cut off if it's causing you to sin, or your eye gouged out if it's causing you to sin, than to enter hell with all of your limbs intact. That brings us to Luke's account. We started this week in chapter 9, verse 18, which is Peter recognizing Jesus as the Christ of God, and Jesus explaining his sufferings and preparing his disciples for lives of sacrifice. And then Luke says about 8 days later. Well, 6 is about 8 days, but it also depends on how you count. And there were a couple different ways of counting days in ancient times. One was to count the days in between 2 events. Another was to count the day of the event and the day on the end. And this is important to know, because when Jesus rises from the dead, we might say, well, how is it 3 days? Because he's buried on Friday, and then Saturday passes, and then he rises on Sunday. But because it was after sunrise on Sunday, by Hebrew reckoning, that was 3 days. You didn't have to have the entirety of the day. They didn't live by a 24-hour clock the way that we do. So about 8 days later, Jesus reveals his glory to his inner circle. He heals the demon-possessed boy, tries to explain his suffering, has to rebuke his disciples' argument about greatness, uses a child to demonstrate that the greatest is the least. And then another story that's not included in the others, he travels through a Samaritan village, or he would, but the Samaritans don't want him because he's Jewish, and there's animosity between the two. And James and John want to call down fire to destroy this village like Sodom and Gomorrah. And Jesus says, no, you knuckleheads, that's not the power that God has given you. That's not what it's for. Remember, this is Jesus who says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And here he puts it into practice. And he confronts then would-be disciples who want to follow Jesus, but first they need to take care of their home or their family, or they want to say their goodbyes. And Jesus tells them that the kingdom of heaven heaven has to come first, that nothing can prevent you from acting now. Paul will later reference this and say, now is the right time. Now is the day of salvation. You can't put it off. In chapter 10, Jesus sends out 72 disciples, so not just the 12, in pairs to preach the kingdom, and they return with joy that the evil spirits can be cast out by them, that they obey them. And Jesus says, don't rejoice over that. Rejoice that your names are written in the book of life, that you're part of the kingdom of heaven. That's the source of our joy, is our inclusion in God's family, not the power that he gives us. He praises his Father's discretion, that God reveals his truths to even the little ones. And he tells a parable to a man who is a Pharisee who comes to him, who summarizes the law as love the Lord your God with everything you got and your neighbor as yourself. But then the man wants to justify himself, so he says, but who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the parable we know as the Good Samaritan, which, of course, on the outset is that, the Samaritan was the example of someone who was kind and compassionate, who represented God by caring for a man that the priest and the Levite had passed by, and had actually paid, had poured wine on the man's wounds, and then actually paid to put him up in an inn. But here's the thing. Jesus himself is the Samaritan. He's the outcast who pours the wine of his blood over our wounds to heal us, who pays for our healing. So I think there's a deeper level that you can understand that parable in. Jesus goes on to the home of Mary and Martha, his good friends, and while Martha's doing the expected thing, which is to busy herself preparing a meal and being the perfect hostess, Mary is allowed to sit at Jesus' feet, a place reserved for disciples to listen to the teachings of Jesus. And whereas Martha expects Jesus to chastise Mary, instead he tells Martha that Mary's chosen better, that it's more important to listen to Jesus than to follow the dictates of society and provide impressive hospitality. Chapter 11, Jesus teaches his disciples to pray boldly, to trust in God's goodness. He refutes those who call his power demonic and teaches the necessity of obeying the word of God. Here we come in Luke to the story of him offering only the sign of Jonah to affirm his authority and urging the crowd to be full of light. He curses the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and of the teachers of the law. And then Jesus promises his followers that someday everything will be revealed and that they can trust the Holy Spirit to give them the words to say, which I think is an essential promise for those of us who speak on behalf of Jesus. He tells a parable warning against being rich in things and poor towards God, and he urges his followers to trust God's provision and to invest in eternity, not the things of this life. He then warns them to watch for his return as faithful servants, and warns also that his claims to be the Son of God will divide families, not because that's God's will, but that is what is going to happen. In chapter 13 of Luke, Jesus rejects the assumption that if you're suffering, that means you're guilty of something. And he warns his followers to do good, not because God will punish you otherwise, but because that's who they are. That's who he is. He heals a crippled woman on the Sabbath, which anytime he heals on the Sabbath, that's considered work by the legalistic sticklers. And he compares his kingdom to small things like seeds that grow great. Jesus urges them to focus on the entrance to heaven through the narrow door. Wide is the road that leads to damnation. Narrow is the door. There's only one way to go through. He's not meaning that's restrictive. He's meaning there's only one way, and that's through a relationship with him. And others will be excluded, not because it's God's will, but because they chose the easy way. And then he weeps along that line for Jerusalem that's going to be destroyed shortly after his time, because God is compassionate and has compassion on those who reject him. Now, in John's version of these things, chapter 7, Jesus travels discreetly, secretly, to the Feast of Tabernacles to avoid being ambushed and made king. That's not his deal. But there he teaches publicly in the temple where the crowds prevent his being arrested, and he denounces his enemies. The crowds wonder if he's the Christ, and he affirms that he's from God and will soon go where they cannot follow. At the feast, he does an amazing thing. At the point in the feast where they get a pitcher of water and have a procession from the spring at the bottom of Jerusalem up to the temple where they pour it out to recall God's provision of water in the desert, Jesus stands up and says, if anybody's thirsty, let him come to me and I'll give him living water to drink. I mean, talk about causing a stir, and talk about a bold claim to be the one who provides what only God can provide. This causes the priests and the Pharisees to debate killing him. In chapter 8, Jesus is asked to condemn a woman who's caught in the act of adultery because, Jesus has this reputation for loving people, but the law says that, someone caught in adultery should be killed. Now, you notice they don't drag the guy there to be killed. And Jesus says, whoever has not this sin, let him cast the first stone. And then he stoops and writes something in the dirt. And we don't know what he wrote. One joker said it's probably the names of the Pharisees' girlfriends. It could also be he wrote the laws of God. And, the wise older ones recognize there are none among them who haven't violated a law of God and don't deserve condemnation. And then Jesus tells the woman that he doesn't condemn her, but she should leave her life of sin. It's not condoning the sin. It's just the grace and mercy of God. He goes on to call himself the light of the world and makes clear that he is one with the Father, that his words are true and eternal life-giving. His adversaries call him a child of the devil. And he goes on to say, I'm actually, I am. Yahweh, the sacred name for God in the Hebrew scriptures, is literally means I am, the God who is. So all the statements when Jesus tells himself, I am, including one in this chapter, are coming up, that I am the great shepherd. These are claims to God, and the Pharisees understood this, and the teachers of the law understood this. That's why they wanted to stone him to death. Jesus heals a man in chapter 9, born blind. The Pharisees interrogate the man, and Jesus calls the Pharisees spiritually blind because they refuse to accept this miracle and accept that Jesus, in performing this miracle, has shown himself to be from God. Even the blind man recognizes this, so they throw him out and they abuse him. In chapter 10, as I said, he identifies himself as the good shepherd who will lay down his life for his sheep and give eternal life to all who follow him. And then we have the story of the Feast of Dedication, where Jesus calls himself God's Son, and he escapes death by stoning through the crowd. So you can see that people are recognizing more and more who Jesus is, but the religious leaders more and more are opposing him and wanting to kill him because he is a challenge to their own authority and their own monopoly on being the ones who represent God. So that's a summary and some explanation of our readings for this past week. I hope you enjoyed them. Look forward to discussing next week's readings. The Lord be with you.